First of all, thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all today. I do believe in the power of journalism to shape the thoughts and minds of our city, and I think it's a very powerful tool. That's why I welcome every opportunity to express my vision to the city in any form. And so thank you again for this opportunity. But I'm running for mayor because I believe that we cannot rely on the basic leadership that has been promised, nor can we repeat the mistakes of the past. When I looked at the mayoral race as it was shaping up, I did not see leadership that was going to progress Memphis into the future. I saw leadership that was going to continue to bet on basic support for people who are hungry every day for more. A city that is faced with high levels of poverty that has not been aggressively enough addressed in our city by leadership. Poverty that is often swept under the table with the promise of a brighter future, while millions of dollars get fed into just one part of town. Our entire city deserves development, and I'm also running for mayor because I see our youth and I see the communities that experience this poverty continuously be underserved and unaddressed. The youth of this city are crying out for help. They need urgent leadership today. They need someone who is going to address their issues, not with just increasing the policing that criminalizes their bodies, but by being innovative and spending money on education. Because only 1/3 of our kids who are graduating from school every year are prepared for work or college, and I don't see leadership that is willing to change that number. And what I bring to the table is a heart for the people. What I bring to the table is a coalition of people who are willing to make that urgent change that is needed so that every part of town gets paved, so that schools and education resources start to get funded, and so that transportation becomes a primary issue, so that poverty is the #1 thing that we address when we're discussing crime, and so that everyone in Memphis starts to feel like they have a chance and an opportunity.
I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tami Sawyer.
She pretty much almost answered what I was going to ask, but let's go delve a little bit deeper. We know that Memphis has a quarter of the people here live in poverty. Youth poverty is somewhere around 39%, and obviously, you being a millennial, a younger person, and then Memphis has a good population of millennials. Memphis has one of the highest numbers of youth. There were young people, a lot of young kids, and it was an interesting thing. The late Phil Trineri told me that one of the things that surprised him when Black Lives Matter came to see him after the bridge shut down was that the #1 issue was temporary jobs. And I said, well, why does that surprise anybody? That kind of thing. So if you were elected mayor, what would you do to deal with those underlying issues like that tend to fuel poverty? Jobs that don't pay enough, lack of education and training, because the thing that a lot of folks say is that kids don't have the education and training. Do you have a specific plan, like Elizabeth Warren? You have a plan?
I have a plan for that.
You got a plan for that? You got a plan for that? We know, I don't need to re-say, you know what it is, but do you have a plan? What's your plan for that?
I think one of the first things is that we have public-private partnerships that our current administration relies on that I feel continue to drive the poverty rate. As we know, up until about 1.5 years ago, on the Chamber's website, it stated, come to Memphis, we have the lowest jobs, we have the lowest wages in the country. So we were selling ourselves as a city where you could get away with paying low wages, while our poverty rate continued to be high. And so while businesses make their own decisions, we know that there is a strong partnership between the administration and the business community, and they need to be pushed in another direction. And so one of my plans, it relies on how we shape our workforce related to pilots. I would freeze our pilot program in order to do an audit and to see what type of benefits and pay are being offered by those who've already received pilots, because we find out afterwards, right? 1 year later, we find out that people weren't getting paid what they needed to get paid. People weren't getting the benefits they needed to get. There were more temporary jobs than there were full-time jobs. And then after we complete that audit, we will reinstate the program with provisions that protect our workforce and allow them to earn what they deserve so that they can take care of themselves and their families. You know, mandating within our pilot contracts that we, you know, that people commit to a certain wage level, making sure that they're committing to a certain percentage of full-time jobs instead of just temporary work. Requesting that they partner with the communities that they serve, with the schools, with the neighborhoods. And these are things that we've seen other cities do that we say here will push business to Mississippi or Arkansas. But when a city stands up for itself, usually, you know, there will be some back and forth, but businesses will continue to play ball. Memphis actually sells itself short as if we don't have resources. We're begging people to come for so little when they know we have the real estate. They know we have, you know, we're pretty much a blank slate for development. We're a blank slate for, you know, all of these companies that want somewhere to have a warehouse or somewhere to have, you know, all of these other resources that we have. And yet, and still, we still say, we'll just roll over and give you whatever you need. We've seen other cities demand, this is the level of pay we want you to pay, and they still come. And I think that we can do that for our people as well. I think it also goes into how we do our MWBE program. We should be, one, reporting those numbers in a more accessible and in a more accessible way. You know, right now the numbers get reported out and they may be right, they might be wrong. We don't know what the numbers really are. There's no public trust in the accountability of that office, and they need to be deaggregated. You know, we can't just talk about minority and women as a group when the majority of the people who are in poverty in Memphis are black people. How many black businesses are getting contracts with the city of Memphis? It's something that I've requested be done on the county commission side, and it's something that I will, you know, make sure is done as mayor. It's on the website, and that we are making sure that that program hits a 30% threshold, and that we actually raise those percentages, you know, fearlessly and not as a second chance thought.
Okay, you've spoken a lot about the, school funding. And can you tell me a little bit about your vision as to how we can use education to tamp down poverty? Because, you know, some of the issues with education obviously is a driver of poverty, and actually a driver of this idea that, well, we have all these jobs, but we can't find people who qualify to do them.
Absolutely. As I stated in my introduction, I think one of the most telling things is that only a third of the graduates of 2019 were considered prepared for work or school. And, you know, we say all the time, we hear people say, everyone's not ready for college, but now everyone's not ready for college or work. So how are we, one, providing a workforce to these businesses that we say we want to recruit, and then two, how are we, you know, ending generational poverty when 2/3 of our kids are about to enter into a workforce unprepared, thus the temporary jobs, thus the unemployment, thus the low wages. And so that's why I believe, you know, my biggest belief, bottom line, is that education is the key to ending poverty and reducing poverty, and that education is the key to reducing our issues with crime. I believe that when we invest in our youth, they make different decisions, they make better decisions because they are inspired to dream bigger. They are inspired to make choices that will allow them to succeed. And so right now, the city of Memphis gives $0 to K through 12 education of a $750 million budget. I think that's outrageous. Outside of what we are mandated to pay from a lawsuit, that we find no way to support K through 12 education. Regardless of what happened with the merger and demerger, there are ways that the city of Memphis could have continued to invest in education under all administrations. And so knowing that every year that we choose not to be a part of the lives of our youth through their education, you know, they're set back even further, and we see that in the data. 1 in 5 of black kids are neither working nor in school between the ages of 16 and 24. You correlate these numbers with crime statistics, you correlate these numbers with poverty, and the equation is so clear that we have to invest in our youth.
Are there other strategies and tactics that you would deploy in addition to investing in pre-K, which obviously is important? What else is in your sphere in terms of education, in terms of investment and tactics?
Well, I'll also say that our current investment in pre-K, one, has not yet been funded, and two, is not comprehensive nor universal. So while it can be considered a start, I don't think that anyone can, claim success there yet, because we do not have a universal standard for pre-K. The first check has yet to be written, and so I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that. We still aren't investing in pre-K in the way that we need to. I think I would want a more rigorous investment in pre-K with standards. And as I said, what we would create is an education and youth opportunity fund. And what this comes down to is our $750 million budget, the pie has to be redrawn. And part of that pie I would want to go towards this youth and education opportunity fund, kind of like a grant process where anyone, schools, organizations can apply for that funding and say, this is how we see an impact on education with the work that we want to do. This is the funding we need. What the city will provide is a body that has oversight on this funding, deciding who gets awarded the grants, making sure that we're auditing and people are reporting back the real outcomes, and making sure that we are hardlining on the fact that we're not giving this money just to anybody, but we expect results out of this. We don't want to recreate the wheel and say, we're the education experts, because that's not the business of the city, but that we want to make sure that the education experts, the youth experts, whether it's someone like a GIF who's doing gang intervention, or it's someone like, a elementary school that, wants to make sure that they have washers and dryers, for uniforms. Whatever it is, that we're making sure that the funding is getting what it's needed, helping with the deficit that Shelby County Schools faces every day.
Would you support raising the tax rate in order to fund this opportunity fund?
So the way that I plan on addressing this in the first year, Ted, is that we start with participatory budgeting. That we go out into the community and we get people to have conversations about how they want to see this pie chopped up. If it comes back that the city is, that the majority of people in the city are saying we don't want more than $1 million going to this because this just seems like pie in the sky, that might not be what I wanted to do, but it might be what happened. I think right now we have too many people disinvested in what's happening in the city, and we need to bring all people to the table. I don't plan to raise taxes on the offset. It's not a day one priority for me, but I also know that our taxes right now have not been able to fund education and other things in the way that we wanted them to happen. I also plan to go after public-private partnerships to also support some of this work. Right now, instead of us telling our partners what we need, they're telling us what they need. Millions of dollars spent to bring Ray Kelly to the city to tell us more about broken windows policing, instead of millions of dollars that could be going towards education. We're watching philanthropists pull their dollars out of education, deciding that it's been a bad bet over these past few years. And we need to return that investment back and make sure that people know where we stand as a city. If they think the city doesn't care about education, they're not going to invest in it themselves.
What are some examples of private partnerships that you envision might be useful in funding education?
Yeah, I think that you bring the people with the money to the table and say that if you have a vision, for Memphis, if you really have a vision for all people in Memphis, this is where the dollars need to go. I'm not a mayor who you can tell this is how I'm going to spend this money and you need to do that. I'm not going to be told, who you want us to deal with, as we've seen the current administration do with the Ray Kelly issue and with others. We will actually go to those with the big dollars. As we know, again, we have an upside down triangle in this city. 63% of Memphis is black, but only 3% of the wealth in this city is black. And so I think we really have to advise people who want to invest, want to see Memphis grow equally, and say, this is where we need you to spend your dollars.
In terms of economic development and the pilots, you mentioned that you would like to see recipients of resources from Memphis also make contributions in neighborhoods and schools. Is your thought that the pilots should be, the program should direct investment to certain parts of the city?
I don't know how in the weeds I would get on that. I don't know if I would say these are two hot zones that I want, if you get a pilot, you need to invest here and here. But I think that it might be welcome to Memphis, please adopt a school. It might be welcome to Memphis, please adopt a highway. I don't know, how deep into the details we would go, but I do think that part of the request would be that you have a community investment. I mean, one of the things that just struck me as outrageous was just last week, or 2 weeks ago, we gave a pilot to a corporation out of China, that's going to pay less than a living wage to its employees. And, we'll tout that as an advancement. And, we can see what multinational corporations are doing across the world, where they're taking the resources of cities and countries and not reinvesting in them. And we don't want to look up and we've been coal mined.
I was going to say one big point that it's been kind of a long-standing practice by cities as diverse as Boston, Orlando, even Cleveland, Ohio, which I think is a correct profile someone to require developers to link projects for which they receive incentives to neighborhood projects.
Yeah.
And we had a piece of this recently with the Whitehaven Memphis President Enterprises agreeing to do work in Whitehaven. So there is a track record of cities asking developers to link their projects to things in the city.
I can promise that we have researched this ad nauseum. I've not made any of this up. Most cities are doing some of what the participatory budgeting I got from San Antonio. You mentioned other cities and who are doing the connecting of community work to pilots. New York demanded a living wage from Amazon. Everyone thought that they had bolted, and New York is now still looking in Amazon. And so what I think that we believe is that we're not worthy enough to demand just a little bit more, that we're going to lose folks to South Haven, that we're going to lose folks to West Memphis, but we're not. I don't think that there's going to be a loss where people are going to flee because we demand more for the people of Memphis. And actually, we might see even stronger businesses choose Memphis, because then they'll say, that's a city that invests in education. I can come there and my workers that I bring with me can actually put their kids in public schools. That's a city that invests in its roads, unanimously across, the city. That's a place where I know I can ride my bike to work every day, or, I can drive without hitting potholes. Like, overall, when people see you invest more in your city, they want to come even more.
If because of years of underfunded education, we have a workforce that is not up to par, perhaps compared to other cities, how would you say Memphis should get around that?
Yeah. I think that we also, when we look at education, I think there's 3 levels, Ted. I think it is pre-K, I think it's K through 12, and then I think it's adult education as well. And I actually think your adult education starts at 16. Not at 16 for the youth who are going to graduate high school and going to be able to get jobs or go to college, but at 16 for the disconnected population, which I share is anywhere from 25% for the entire city to, it's 20% for the entire city, 25% for Black youth. And so I think at 16 we start with adult literacy programs, we start with workforce development programs, and we also need to make sure that we have apprenticeships and mentorships. When I meet with the unions, one of the things they talk about all the time is being able to connect with high schools so that they can start to prepare a workforce as well. And I think that's where when you look at something like a Youth and Education Opportunity Fund, an organization like a union that needs more welders, excuse me, that needs a trained workforce, is able then to get to the youth, to talk to them about their programs, to start to be mentors, and to to train employees. Collierville opened a $100 million school with a gourmet chef and MacBooks for every student. We had 6 schools closed on the first week of school because of lack of air conditioning or electricity, some of which related to the storm, some of which was related to deferred maintenance. And so think about that. In the first week of school, we're already setting the stage for disparity in our kids. But the interesting thing about the Collierville school, the only reason I bring it up is because what they were able to do is when they built that school, they put in place apprenticeship agreements with local unions and trade workers because they knew every kid wasn't going to graduate with a diploma and head off to Rhodes or Vandy. They knew some of their children were going to end up working, but they wanted them trained. Their kids are graduating from the new high school with 2 or 3 technical certifications. Why don't we have that inside the city limits as well? And so it's not about, this is why I say the city needs an advocate, because all of these things can happen if you're setting a vision for a city and asking people to come to the table and make it happen.
I mean, what happened here? I mean, we could have been sitting here in 2009, 1999, having this very same discussion.
I think I was like 12.
What happened?
I go back to my return home and I call these last 5 or 6 years in the country a great reawakening. I think that as a world we were lulled into a belief that equality had been achieved. Mass incarceration and the war on drugs decimated Black middle-class communities, but also we were very heavy on a lot of it's related to personal responsibility. At the time, we weren't exploring poverty and education as indicators of disconnection, as indicators of people being underserviced by their communities. And now all research shows to a very pointed effort by both of these engines, mass incarceration and war on drugs, that have really, add that with redlining, add that with all of these other things that were happening at the same time. And now the conversation tilts from personal responsibility, which will always be important. People always have a decision, right? Never believe that I'm saying that anyone is making a choice because they don't know better. But people always have a decision, but cities have a responsibility to reconnect people to the services that we've disconnected them from for years. And I think we had to get through the 90s and the 2000s where we were able to look back and see how many folks we really underserved. I don't think being in it, I think the story of the 90s is still being written. I was a youth, right? But at that time, what I knew about the war on drugs, what I knew about mass incarceration was people making a decision to sell drugs, people making a decision to use drugs. We now know different about how those things were orchestrated. I think that's how you get here. You couldn't see it when you were in it. We're past it. Now how do we repair those communities that were destroyed?
Got a related question to that, somewhat related. You've talked about national issues for a good period of your public service, whether it's the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Trayvon Martin, of course, as well as more recent national issues. One of your opponents, the incumbent mayor, said he doesn't talk about those issues because it is divisive, it fosters conflict. Why is your approach better, and what do you think it gains Memphis by being so vocal about national issues?
I think it's tone deaf to believe that we can not talk about national issues when we are a part of this nation. And when we see what's happening nationally, it's a mirror for what's happening in Memphis. I talk about ICE because right here in Memphis, we have the fastest growing immigrant population in the state, right? So when 600 people get taken from their families in Mississippi, less than 3 hours away, and the mayor doesn't address that, think about the families that are here that didn't sleep in their own homes that night because they were afraid that the raids were coming to Memphis, right? When we don't talk about climate change, think about the people who are here who are now hearing, hey, no, Memphis doesn't have the best water in the country like we've been led to believe all our life. There's lead riddled all throughout our city, right? So we can't say that, I really don't like the word divisive, because I think it gets us away, it lets us ignore the issues by saying that something is divisive. We can't get away from national issues because we're almost a petri dish for national issues. When the economic downturn finally hits, Memphis is going to be one of the first places that we're going to see it happen. We still rely on warehouse jobs. We still rely on manufacturing jobs. We haven't figured out how to launch a tech industry. We haven't figured out how to fund creative networks. And so when warehouses start closing doors, guess where they're going to close? On those temporary jobs that everybody has, right? When philanthropists we're seeing it happen in the 2020 budgets, are pulling their dollars back. Agape, plow closing, right? Plow closing is a sign of the times. I actually asked somebody with another foundation, what does this signal for you? And they said, well, we're not closing now. We could be gone in 10 years, right? And so what does that mean for us when we've relied so heavily on the dollars of the rich and not started to invest those in programming for the poor? And so if Agape, why do I keep saying Agape? If Plow, can no longer fund aging studies and resources for the elderly, we have to fill in that gap. And we can't fill in that gap in 5 years when they finally close. We have to aggressively be aware of the trend of people are pulling their dollars in-house. And so national issues are Memphis issues. I don't know how anyone thinks that a city of our size that strives to be a top 25 city can exist in a bubble. And yet the mayor does focus on national issues, right? Because he's competing to have a world-class downtown. He's competing to make sure that our ballparks are all well built and clean and wanting to be able to get an all-star game here, thus investing in more and more hotels, right? So you compete on the national issues that you choose to, but when we bring social issues to the table, they're dismissed as divisive. People can no longer ignore social issues, or we're going to have an even bigger crisis for our people on our hands.
I want to make sure my colleague Ron has a chance.
So we are coming up on 200 homicides, or we are on pace to have 200 homicides this year, which is below the record-breaking number in 2016, but is still worrisomely high. What can a mayor do to address the murder rate and drive down other violent crime trends?
Yeah. I go back to the fact that you can't exist in a bubble. What have other cities done? We've researched very heavily other alternatives to just funding more police officers on the street. I'd like to state unequivocally that I'm not anti-police, that I have no interest in dismantling the police force, but I don't think that the incumbent and I agree on what the right size is. And while I don't have a number, what I do know is that if we invest in our youth, if we invest in our neighborhoods, we'll see that pay off in terms of crime rates going down. When you put more police on the streets, they arrest more people. Arresting more people means what? Your crime rate raises, because those are arrest numbers, those are crime numbers committed. And what we also tend to see is that as police forces grow, also broken windows type of policing tactics grow as well. People start getting arrested for things like loitering and littering instead of what we are saying we're trying to address, which are the violent crimes of murder and what we're especially dealing with in Memphis, domestic abuse. And so what I'd like to see is, one, us start to be real about mental health in our city. That's trauma-informed police officers, as well as just a trauma-informed city as well. When you add in all of the statistics that I talked about, whether it's underfunded education, generational poverty, dismantling of communities, and most murders are committed in this city between people who are in close community with each other, whether inside a home between family members, or you'll often find that people knew each other in some way or another. And so, of course, we have the times where there's a robbery associated with a crime, but most of the murders that are happening in our city are not that. And so what we do need to address are, like I said, investing in making sure we're a mental health and trauma-informed city, investing in our communities and investing in education, redirecting our police department into one that is community oriented so that they can recognize the signs of need before a crime is committed, and also gun violence, right? And so what are we going to do about the number of guns that are on the street? The state removed protections that we had by, allowing guns in more places, especially in cars. And so we as a city need to be able to combat the fact that, guns are just everywhere. They're being dumped in communities, and they're just being able to be accessed in too many ways. We've got to have programs that, teach people everywhere, no questions answered. This is how you use a gun lock, and if you walk into a police department and you want one, you get one. If you walk into a school and a parent asks a principal for a gun lock, they get one. We also need to go back to the days of what A.C. Wharton used to have, guns for gas. And, the thing about that is the state legislature doesn't allow guns to be destroyed. You have to resell them. So, right, you're now recirculating that into the street. But getting them off the streets, getting them out of the North Memphises and the South Memphises, and is even better. And we deal with what the state regulations are on the back end. Sell them elsewhere. Sell them to collectors. Sell them at hunting events. I think also we set a tone. Right? I received an email from a constituent that says, you all, fund the Agri Center, and the Agri Center has a gun show at least once a month. And I pulled up the calendar, and he was right. Right? So at one point we're saying we're disgusted by the number of violent homicides in the city, and on the other hand, we have a gun culture. So we have to change our gun culture. And I don't think that we reduce violent crimes with more officers on the street, because the officers are solving the crime, right? They're not reducing the crime.
So you said you don't have a number in mind for officers, but would you like to see less than we currently have?
I don't know that I'm advocating for a reduction in police force. I'm advocating that we not put all our eggs in the bring more police on board basket.
And I know you've talked about wanting to invest in other, and you just mentioned in kind of preventative policing.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that you would do that, rather than, and would you take from the current police budget to invest in those other methods?
So I think it starts with your leadership. I would ask the current police director to reapply, and I would also source for police directors outside of the city. In Stockton, California, which has similar poverty concerns as Memphis, they were able to not only reduce their violent crime rate, but also to reduce their incidences of officer-related shootings by having a police chief who actually applied for the job here, who was community informed and was trauma informed and was able to apply those policies. And honestly, Ryan, some of these, changes are cultural changes that don't cost anything, right? And so it doesn't take from the police budget to say, hey, we're gonna have, some diversity training. Hey, we're gonna have trauma informed training. This is how we're going to, engage with our community. That's about a culture change.
You mentioned the police director position. That would be one of the biggest appointments that you would make. Do you have an idea for what you want in the next police director? And also, you mentioned would you consider Rawlings if he reapplied?
So it is one of the biggest decisions, and I will not make that alone. I'm actually going to follow Frank Scott of Little Rock's model, the new mayor there. He let the community give input. He gave his finalists to the community, held a few town halls, and people got to give their input on, who they thought was best and what they wanted to see in a police officer, and I would do the same. Because I think that's how you begin to build investment both ways, right? If the people aren't afraid of the police officers, and if the police officers aren't afraid of the people, everyone's jobs can be that much stronger. And so I would invite Director Rawlings to reapply. But the position would be considered open. And any police director would be asked to present their idea for community-oriented policing, to show a roadmap to reduction of crime through that, and how they will show their commitment to the people of Memphis, and the values that I would want our administration to be led on. I would also ask the police director to be led in the same way. And I would also ask them to bring in their own data person, because I would not rely on the Shelby County Memphis Crime Commission to do that work for us. And we would be autonomous in that work, and it would be owned by the city itself. And yes.
Commissioner, what have you learned about yourself and your city throughout the campaign?
It's always my favorite.
It's always our last question.
I think what I've learned about myself is that I'm a resilient person, that I'm able to stand up on what I believe in, no matter what people say or think about that. And that I do believe that Memphis my love for Memphis has, is tested, tried, and true. And that I do think that there is a path forward for us as a city to be a city that values everyone while also growing in the ways that we want to grow economically. I think that it's proven to me, and one of the things that all the research that we've done, all of the people we've talked to, all of the homes that we've been in, is that people want this to be a city that's representative of the way it's made up, and that it wants it to be a city that's not continuously highest in poverty, lowest in educational attainment. And what I do believe is that people just want a vision forward. And so I've taken the opportunity and the pleasure and the honor to draft that vision so that we can get there together.